Hi all, I'd like to show you another amazing encounter between Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand. This was in a classical time control tournament, the very famous Linares tournament held in Spain in 2009. Linares was dominated at one point by Kasparov for many years. It's one of his favourite venues. So Magnus Carlsen playing white was 2-7-7-6 at the time of this game, and Vishy Anand 2-7-9-1. And it kicked off with d4. Magnus played d4, and we saw Vishy Anand's favourite defence to d4, which is the Slav defence, which is used successfully in World Championship title matches and challenge matches. So the Slav is very solid. We see knight c3 here, knight f6, and now e3, a very popular continuation. e3, although it's hemming in the bishop, it's safeguarding c4 immediately. e6, so this very strong fortified centre, this Slav triangle, Semi-Slav, the bishop is voluntarily put within the pawn chain for the moment. Knight f3, knight bd7, not touching the bishop on f8, leaving that flexible at the moment for either e7 or d6. That's actually the most popular move here by far, just to play knight bd7. Now here the top move popularity wise in my live book is queen c2, and that's what's played. After bishop d6 there's a few alternatives for white which are quite interesting. Bishop d3 is the most popular, bishop e2 second, b3 third, but this other one is quite a dynamic choice here, and it's actually g4, so offering the g pawn to try and get some pressure down the g file. So black has to tread carefully, of course, here, and it's sharper than usual now, immediately quite a sharp position. Now black has got various options, the most popular just taking on c4 actually, all that with 485 games. h6 is another popular idea, bishop b4, but knight takes g4, it has been played quite a bit as well, just taking. And we see rook g1. And now the knight going back isn't such a hot idea. That isn't really played that much here. This isn't the idea from a black perspective. In this position, actually, white's doing quite well after rook takes g7. This continuation is quite nice for white. White's going to be castling queenside, and that's very nice. It's inhibited black from safely castling. No, the idea of taking here is actually usually either f5 to support the knight, or taking on h2, or this other move, queen f6, hitting back on f3. So that knight is now exposed. Rook takes g4, queen takes f3, rook takes g7, knight f6. This is a well-trodden path in this variation. And black now threatens knight g4. That can be a dangerous threat here. So white takes time now to safeguard the g4 square with the move h3. And what is interesting now is that Vishy Anand, maybe, you know, he could try, pardon me, h6 here, or bishop d7, or taking on c4, but he volunteered double pawns with queen f5, and we're kind of out of book. And this invitation for a queenless position, but black's structure is a bit rocked here if white takes, and Magnus did take. So after e takes, we can observe this diced pawn structure, and after cd, diced even more, another isolated pawn on d5. So we got isolated double pawns on the f file, the h pawn and d5 pawn. But are they really that exploitable? Well, we see now knight b5. And this causes some immediate problems. Let's see, if bishop b8, then actually bishop d2 is very nice for white, with the idea of rook c1. There's no time to kick the knight here because of rook c1, and that's very dangerous, hitting c8. Then knight c7 check, big advantage to white. So this is a very annoying move, knight b5. So we see bishop b4 check, bishop d2. Offering the exchange of bishops. So okay, black's been slightly weakened on the dark squares, and this bishop is locked in by its own structure here for the moment. Although knight e4 check looks tempting, I'm not entirely sure it does anything. King e1 is apparently the strongest move, not king e2, bishop d7 and black's okay. I think king e1 a bit stronger to keep the king off the light squares, and white is looking forward to various things here. So basically it's not that appetizing to play that check. If we just go back, so king e7 was played, rook c1 is interesting, but bishop d3 now, bishop e6, and now we see Magnus simplifying the position further with knight c7 forking the rook and the bishop. And the interesting thing here, after rook ag8, he has time for knight takes e6 because he's protecting the rook here, so keeping the pawn structure diced. But is anything exploitable? Well, f5 is the most exploitable, it would seem, from this continuation. Magnus takes on g8. After knight takes g8, king e2, which portrays an idea that maybe king f3 to f4 now to gang up on this f5 pawn. Knight e7, king f3, rook c8, and now white plays on both sides of the board actually. a4 with the possible intention of a5 and a6, so rook c7, a5, but actually a6 is tested as a threat. Does white really want to play a6? It wasn't played, it's a bit committal. Magnus instead plays h4, and it looks as though this pawn might be loose here, surely. Well, the thing is, if knight g6 we can just kick this knight back, and where's the knight going after that? It just has to go back in its box. That just helps white. White's got even more pressure there, so the pawn's not actually that much of a problem here. King f6, and now we see h5. Again, the pawn's not really a problem even with the king. If the king tries to get to it, we can just play check here. If king takes, this is a very, very big advantage for white. King f4 threatens a kind of mating net now with bishop e2 and rook h4 mating. If the king has to come to h4, that's not good at all. So it's no problem putting the pawn on h5. So black plays knight c8 now, king f4, knight d6. So the knight is protecting, it seems, usefully f5. So a lot of pressure being exerted on f5 now. Can Magnus do anything with this pressure? Rook g1. So it looks as though rook g8 will be very handy. That's stopped. f3. If in that position, instead of rook c8, knight e4 was played, then rook g8, knight takes f2, for example, bishop takes f5. White is a little bit better here, has increased his advantage. He's got an eye on rook h6, to play rook takes h6 soon. So white is a little bit better there. That was avoided. So rook c8, f3. But black is on the defensive here. King e6, inviting rook g7, just testing it as a threat, because now actually black has rook h8. And what is the rook doing? Well, we see bishop c2, a different plan now, that the bishop can come here to pin the pawn, making e4 potentially very useful, introducing that pin into the position. So that's a little mini plan. Now rook h8. Did white improve the position much? Rook g1, and it looks as though rook c1's now threatened. So rook c8, rook g7, and again it looks as though rook h7 is threatened, rook h8. So Magnus playing literally a cat and mouse game. Tom and Jerry attack, threatening, and then parrying the threat, threatening, parrying the threat, this pattern. So at move 35, rook g2, but they're approaching perhaps the first time control at move 40. Rook c8, rook g1. Not going for rook c2. I think this might be a way of getting a tiny advantage as well. But Magnus didn't go for that. He kept a bit of more tension in the position. Kept the rooks on here with rook g1. Knight e8. And there's a kind of weakness of the last move. It's not on e4 anymore. So Magnus does actually go for e4, even though it looks as though black's going to get this pawn. So maybe some precise calculation needed here after takes down knight f6. So it looks as though h5 might be a problem. And there's two major options here, e5 or ed, and you have to weigh the pros and cons of both of these. And Magnus weighed in that actually e5 was stronger than ed. Let's have a quick look at ed. In this position, actually, black does well not to play knight takes, because then king e4 is pretty nasty. Just it's that piece is in trouble. This is a troublesome position. That is a horrendous pin. No, the idea of this would be, I think black would be doing well to play king d6 here, and this should be okay for black. Black's holding the balance. Just going to play rook g8 next. The pawn structure is really too weakened here to be effective. So actually keeping the pawns intact, e5, even though the knight seems to have a very nice square on e4 here. But if the knight took on h5, by the way, then just king e3, and this knight is threatened with bishop d1 here. For example, king e7, bishop d1, and this is sorry. If in this position, black doesn't get the king off a dark square, then rook c1 isn't possible here. So after king e7, instead of bishop d1 now, bishop takes d5 is strong for white with a clear advantage. The knight's kind of stranded on the edge here. But if we instead just played a move like rook c6, then the knight would be in big trouble. There isn't the rook c1 resource because of bishop g4 check winning the rook here. So this knight, basically, it can't really take on h5 in this position. It's pretty bad if it does. So knight e4 is played, king e3. White has a small advantage. b6, a takes. Now king d3. So white's waiting for black to commit to some sort of further weakness, and perhaps trying to target h6 at the right time. We see check, king e2, knight e4, king e3. So what does black want to do here? It's getting a bit more difficult for black to play this position, and this might be an indicator of what it's going to be like in the World Championship, where instead of agreeing a draw, Magnus will just play on and on and on, trying to grind an advantage. Now in this position it has got a bit tricky. If the rook leaves g8, I mean let's say the rook leaves g8 like this, then rook g8 is actually strong here, with the idea of like either rook b8 or maybe even just check now to take d5. That's actually the key threat, to take on d5. And if the rook leaves the c file, I mean let's say rook h8, then that's a kind of weakness of the last move as well. So we'd pounce onto that weakness of the last move. But it seems whatever black does, he's leaving a weakness of the last move in this position. It's a high pressure position. The engine suggests actually to try and minimize any damage, knight g5. And this continuation, rook a1, looks dangerous for rook a6. And black could continue with f6, and apparently it should be just about okay for black. But in the game, we get to see something more radical. We get to see f6, which leaves, of course, the g6 square. Is that really useful for white to invade on g6? Well, it is played. And there is a tactical idea, like taking and then taking here to take on f6, as well as taking on h6. Rook c1, taking now on h6 looks attractive, but the engine suggests here, this is interesting, a missed opportunity for Magnus, that actually here e takes f6 might have actually been stronger. For example, knight takes, bishop takes d5 is good for white, and if rook e1 check, king d3, knight takes, again bishop takes d5, and this position with bishop f3, this is nice for white as well. So it might have been a tiny inaccuracy to take on h6 here, and the reason is this rook h1 actually threatens rook h3 tactically to win this bishop. It is a loose bishop on b3. And you might ask, well, hold on, are you really convinced by that this was an inaccuracy? Well, e takes here. I mean, what does actually black play in this position? If rook h1 here, then actually f7 check is strong, and if takes, then bishop takes d5, losing the knight. It's very, very difficult for black after e takes f6. Basically, if check here, king d3, knight takes. Again, this is just a difficult position. So anyway, let's go back. So rook takes h6. We see this rook h1. Has Magnus really got anything to play with in this position? From an engine point of view, move 46, it's virtually nothing. It's like 0.10 of an advantage at depth 23. So it requires some slip-ups technically from black. Bishop c2, and here is the slip-up at move 47. It seems Vishy could have just played rook e1 check in this position and held equality. If, for example, king f3, then just check, and if the king ever goes back, then there's rook f2 winning the bishop. So where does the king go? If the king goes to g4, then just check. Just check, check, check. And this should be okay. How does white actually escape the checks? If we get this position, then rook h1 in this position, and there's no threats for white. So strangely though, there is this major slip up in this position, where instead of rook e1 check, which promises a perpetual check sequence, we see rook h3 check instead. Slight miscalculation maybe, because now the king actually goes to f4, and there's a major threat of taking on e4 followed by taking on f6, and the perpetual checks here just run out like this. With rook h4 check, the king now drops to f3, and the checks are going to run out. If rook h3 check here, which wasn't played, king g4, and now this is big trouble for black. White is still threatening things like bishop takes e4 and rook f6. What does actually black do here? If he plays rook e3, king f4 gets a critical tempo, and in this position bishop d3, and we're zugzwanging black. There's no check on at f1. This is hit a zugzwang. Now if king f7 check, if king g8, we play rook c7 with a big advantage. If the king moved back to e6, again rook b7 with a big advantage. So somehow this, unfortunately for Vishy now, is not perpetual check. Sorry, this position is not perpetual check with the rook, that's for sure, because the king going to g4 on rook h3. So it's critical now for black. It's actually become sort of equal. This is approaching 1.5 pawn advantage for white. Black tried knight d2 check, king g3 is tempting, but actually king e2 was played. Check, king d1. What does black actually do? He's going to start to lose more material now. He's going to lose f6. If the knight goes back, surely now white can just take on e4 in this position, then take on f6, big advantage. But black has slipped up here. So knight c4, rook takes f6, king e7. Now bishop g6, holding the h pawn and inviting the loss of both these pawns. You might think, isn't this significant enough to draw? Check, rook c1, rook takes d4. In this position, we see what appears to be a very good idea indeed in this position. In fact, probably the only move for an advantage at the moment. The rook can't take on b6, so white plays b3, nudging the knight away from b6. Knight takes e5, bishop takes b6. Sorry, rook takes b6. So we've got two passed pawns. Black's got the passed pawn here. Is this enough to win? Rook h4. Bishop f5 threatens rook e6 check, so no time for taking on h5. Knight f3. And this actually, in this position, this was another critical mistake now at move 57. If check here, king c2, knight f3, this might actually be almost drawable for black, because there's numerous threats. Well, knight d4 check is threatened. When does the bishop want to go? If bishop g4 check, it's going to be difficult for white to win. But actually, after this bishop f5, there was a little bit of a slip up in terms of the check on h1. There was knight f3, and now Magnus plays h6, which gives a big advantage now for white. This is a very, very dangerous passed h pawn. What does black actually do about this? Actually, black is forcibly losing the exchange and probably the game by force now. Black tried knight d4. Can you see what Magnus did here with his bishop attacked? If I give you 10 seconds, you might want to pause the video. So 10 seconds starting from now. White play. What did Magnus play? It's very, very clever how in this very simplified position this h-pawn is actually winning material now. h7. You might think, what's this? Knight takes f5, and now can you spot what white plays in this position? Beautiful tactics. Now in this simplified position, white to play. What would you play here with white? At move 60, winning the exchange with rook b8, threatening to queen. The knight can't help the h8 square. There's no useful checks here. They'd run out. So rook takes h7, just loses the exchange. Black tried knight d4 to try and give up the rook more favourably to take this pawn, but Magnus first protects his pawn. It is important not to reach a raw rook and knight, rook versus knight ending. This pawn's going to be critical to have as well. But white is winning the exchange now. King d6, h8. And the rest is now kind of technique, just the exchange up with that b pawn. This is a technique win now. Vishy played on for a few more moves. So rook h5, knight c6, rook h4, knight b4, virtually the only move to stay in the game. But it's a lost position anyway. King a3, d4. What else here? If the knight moves back, then b4 check is now possible. White is making progress after king b5, king b3. So in this position, d4, but now check, knight d5, king b2, king c6, king a3, king c5, rook h4, knight b4, rook h8. The knight is getting a bit overloaded here. Knight c6, check, king d6, b4. Finally this b pawn is moving, and that starts to signify, well, this pawn is now too loose here. It's attacked. Knight e5, king b3, d2. The pawn is just far too loose. There's one last little trick maybe in this position, or is it all winning? In the game, king c2 was played. If rook h1, it's still winning for white. There's no real tricks here. King c2 was played, knight c6, and rook h4, just safeguarding that pawn again, just to mop up this pawn with the king. After king d5, with this move, Vishy Anand resigned. And this long grinding game was the first win which Magnus Carlsen ever had, it seems, against Vishy Anand. So this was in Linares 2009. So this was the first classical time control win on record that Magnus beat Vishy. He's only beaten Vishy so far, we're talking in 2013 with the World Championship next month. He's only beaten him 3 times in the classical time controls. It's something like 6-3 on the classical time control clashes. So I hope you check out the playlist, the WC 2013 link, which I'll put in the video, as this was a very, very important first encounter. A bit of a grinding game to go over, but I think will be quite indicative of some of the World Championship games we're going to see. There are going to be some grinds, I believe, next month. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.